OPEC has to be destroyed in an economic sense. You have to do something about OPEC. They can't. It really is an illegal situation that they are doing from any standpoint in most countries. The truth is, I know people involved in OPEC. They laugh at the stupidity of our country. When Donald Trump told Fox News in 2009 that OPEC had to be destroyed, few treated his words as anything more than a populist slogan. At the time, the cartel still looked almost untouchable. Just a year earlier, amid record oil prices, OPEC had accounted for roughly 43% of global crude production. It was widely seen as an organization whose position no outside force could seriously threaten. Today, however, the foundations of OPEC's power, including its political foundations, are shifting dramatically. The oil monolith is beginning to crack before our eyes. The most serious structural blow to the bloc's unity appears to be the recent decision by the United Arab Emirates to leave both OPEC and the wider OPEC Plus format. At the same time, the memorandum signed between the United States and Iran in mid-June opens the door for Iranian crude to return to the regular market, and in very large volumes. Add to this the possibility of an end to the war in Ukraine, the return of Russian oil to normal market channels, and the fact that in a post-war reality Moscow may place its own domestic interests above the collective goals of OPEC+. Taken together, these developments paint a rather bleak picture of the cartel's future. So, as the global oil chessboard is beginning rearranged, and as yesterday's allies may increasingly start playing for themselves, one fundamental question emerges. What future awaits OPEC and OPEC+? Let's find out. To better understand OPEC's current crisis, we first need to say a few words about a much broader format, OPEC+, and go slightly back in time. In January 2016, Saudi Arabia was waging a price war against American producers. The goal was to eliminate the competition created by the shale revolution that had begun in the United States a few years earlier. Prices did indeed collapse. In January 2016, a barrel of Brent crude fell below $30, but American producers proved far more resilient than expected. It was then that the idea of OPEC Plus emerged, a mechanism for creating oil markets among a group of countries far wider than the members of the old cartel. But one might ask a simple question. Why would these countries bind themselves with agreements at all instead of simply selling as much oil as they can? The logic of a cartel is straightforward. When every producer acts alone, each has an incentive to pump as much as possible and sell before others do, which quickly leads to oversupply and falling prices. But if the biggest players agree on joint production limits, they can restrict supply, stabilize the market, and keep prices at levels that suit their budgets. This is also why this arrangement is often described pejoratively as a cartel. OPEC Plus was ultimately created on December 10, 2016. A major role in building the format was played by Khalid Al-Falih, the highly pragmatic Saudi oil minister, and by the rising star of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. In addition to the members of the old OPEC, 11 other countries joined OPEC Plus. These included, of course, Russia, but also countries such as Mexico, Kazakhstan, and Oman. The significance of this new format for global markets is best captured by one simple statistic. While the old OPEC accounted for around 35% of global oil production, the new OPEC Plus controlled more than 55%. OPEC Plus proved to be an unusually effective alliance. In 2017, compliance with the cuts was high, surplus inventories were shrinking, and by the autumn of 2018, Brent crude was approaching $85 a barrel. In July 2019, the group signed a charter of cooperation, formalizing the partnership for the longer term. There was, however, one important caveat. From the very beginning of the deal, Russia regularly violated the agreed limits and produced more oil than it was supposed to under OPEC Plus agreements. At first, Moscow argued that unlike Saudi Arabia, where production can in effect be turned down from one day to the next, rapidly shutting down output in Siberia in the middle of a harsh winter risked causing irreversible damage to infrastructure. The Saudis accepted this argument, and a recurring pattern inside the group began to take shape. Over the following years, Russia would repeatedly exceed its limits, or at the very least, implement them slowly. Why did Riyadh accept this? The Saudis concluded that without Russia's participation, any production cuts would be far less effective and have a much weaker impact on the market. At the same time, Saudi Arabia, with its enormous spare production capacity, could adjust its own output flexibly and assume the role of swing producer, taking on a larger share of the burden. In its dealings with Moscow, Riyadh therefore often chose the carrot over the stick, accepting disproportionately large cuts in exchange for the market stability. Cooperation with Russia also fit into Mohammed bin Salman's broader strategy of building closer relations with Vladimir Putin. This does not mean, however, that Saudi-Russian cooperation was free of tension or crisis. The clearest example came at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. As soon as forecasts pointed to a sharp fall in oil demand, the Saudis proposed immediate production cuts. Russia favored a more cautious approach and wanted to wait until the real impact of the pandemic became clearer. The result was a short but brutal price war, which at one point even pushed the price of American WTI crude below zero for the first time in history. In the end, the Saudi-Russian conflict was resolved, paradoxically, only after US mediation. And although after the price war, many observers believed OPEC Plus was bound to fall apart, the crisis in fact ended up strengthening the Russian-Saudi alliance, testing it under the most extreme conditions. The creation of OPEC Plus and Russia's entry into the format is sometimes compared to, quote, letting the fox into the henhouse. The reason is the pattern already mentioned, Russia's failure to stick to agreed production quotas, which gradually began to erode discipline among other members of the cartel. Historically, discipline within OPEC itself had often been uneven. But in the 1990s, as the global oil market changed, OPEC countries began to see more clearly the benefits of price stabilization. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates in particular were willing to shoulder a larger share of supply restrictions if that helped limit market volatility and support long-term balance, often in contrast to countries such as Venezuela or Iran, for whom the fate of the cartel seemed secondary. The United Arab Emirates played a special role here. Even as geopolitical disputes with Saudi Arabia became more frequent, on the oil market Abu Dhabi remained a clear supporter of Saudi leadership, becoming Riyadh's loyal wingman. But 2016, the creation of OPEC Plus and the birth of the Saudi-Russian axis shook the old arrangement. After 2016, loyalty to the Saudis simply stopped paying off for the Emirates. The UAE had to bear disproportionately high costs for stabilizing the market. And we are talking about a country that was pouring massive financial resources into expanding its state-owned giant ADNOC, pushing production capacity toward a target of 5 million barrels per day. In late 2020, the British think tank Chatham House estimated that the Emirati quota of 3.1 million barrels per day, frozen at the October 2018 level, allowed the country to use barely around 60% of its production capacity. In practice, this meant that the cuts hit the UAE harder, in relative terms, than any other OPEC Plus member. In this context, the UAE's decision announced at April 28, 2026 to leave both OPEC and OPEC Plus was a true earthquake. The cartel lost its third largest producer, taking with it more than 10% of OPEC's total output. And from a broader OPEC Plus agreement, disappeared the fourth largest player, and most importantly, a large share of spare capacity buffer mentioned earlier. The UAE's decision to leave the cartel also has a political background. In recent years, the geopolitical rivalry between Saudi Arabia and the Emirates has intensified. Yemen, Sudan, the Horn of Africa. In all these places, the interests of the two countries collide, often through support for opposing factions. the war with Iran added another layer. During the conflict, Iran fired more ballistic missiles and drones toward Abu Dhabi and other Emirati cities than toward Israel. The UAE wanted to respond militarily by striking targets inside Iran. Saudi Arabia, which did not face Iranian attacks on the same scale, opposed such a move. Riyadh's cautious position pushed the Emirates even further toward leaving the cartel and tightening their ties with the United States and Israel. The UAE's exit from OPEC Plus carries not only major economic consequences for the group, but political ones as well. The expansion of the cartel into OPEC Plus format in 2016 pushed Saudi Arabia and the group as a whole toward a more antagonistic stance on certain American interests. In the Persian Gulf, in relation to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and in its unwillingness to suppress high oil prices that hurt American consumers. The Emirates disagreed with this line. In September 2022, for example, responding to American requests, Abu Dhabi tried to persuade Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to abandon planned OPEC Plus production cuts, which the White House strongly opposed. To that end, Sheikh Tahnoun bin Zayed Al Nahyan, the national security advisor and one of the most influential figures in the UAE, personally traveled to Riyadh. The mission failed. In hindsight, that meeting can be seen as the moment that sealed the breakdown of the Saudi-Emirati alliance. Given these political implications, it is hardly surprising that some have linked the timing of the UAE's decision to leave OPEC Plus with its negotiations with the United States over opening swap lines for the Emirates. In simple terms, an American financial lifeline designed to secure liquidity. In broad terms, this is a mechanism through which a country's central bank can, in a crisis, quickly gain access to dollars directly from the US Federal Reserve or the Treasury Department. In practice, it is a guarantee that in a moment of panic, such as when Abu Dhabi was being attacked by Iran and the Emirates saw a massive outflow of capital, dollars will not run out. The country does not have to liquidate US bonds or frighten the markets. The United States grants this privilege on a permanent basis only to a handful of its closest partners: the European Union, Japan, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Switzerland. For a Gulf state, gaining such access would mean entering an entirely different league and accepting an entirely different level of dependence on America. According to the Wall Street Journal, the UAE was already holding talks in mid-April with US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent about a potential swap line as wartime financial lifeline. Just days later, the Emirates announced their withdrawal from OPEC and OPEC+. It is therefore no surprise that speculation has grown over the real motives behind the arrangement. Al Jazeera described the entire sequence of events as an overtly political move, signaling a strategic rapprochement between Abu Dhabi and Washington. Guys, two short announcements before we move on. First, Serhi, who translated GTBT Ukraine before enlisting in the Ukrainian Air Force, has set up a fundraiser to collect money for shelters for Ukraine's unmanned systems, helping keep them safe from Russian long-range drones. You can support the fundraiser via the link down below. Second, as you might already know, we continue publishing GTBT's short format series called Essence. Basically, these are our episodes turned into 8-10-minute pills. And no, the voice actor is not AI. Pozdrawiam, Barney. Okay, let's move on. All of this brings us to the central question. Will the departure of a key OPEC Plus player threaten the future of the oil alliance? And does the world even need countries that control a significant share of global supply, and through coordinated action can shape the price of what remains the most important commodity on Earth? There is even a remarkably accurate saying in the oil market. Quote, "The cure for high oil prices is even higher prices, and the cure for low prices is even lower prices." The mechanism is simple. When oil becomes too expensive, it begins to weigh on the entire economy. It raises the cost of transport, production, and everyday life, and eventually suppresses demand. At the same time, high prices encourage companies to develop more expensive fields that were previously uneconomic, including outside OPEC. And after a while, more oil reaches the market, demand weakens, and prices start to fall. For decades, OPEC acted as a global shock absorber, limiting market volatility both when prices were relatively high and when they were low. Its key tool were spare capacity, concentrated mainly in the hands of Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which functioned as a powerful buffer. As Axel Pieru, James L. Smith and Tamim Zamrik calculated in the Energy Journal in 2018, the cartel's spare capacity historically reduced oil price volatility by as much as half. More recent analyses by the CapSarc think tank show that without OPEC interventions, oil price volatility during the commodity boom of 2001 to 2015 would have been at least 50% higher. And after the creation of OPEC+, in the period from 2017 to 2021, price swings, according to the authors, would have been as much as 100% to 120% greater. But the role of global stabilizer comes at high price. According to a 2017 study by researchers from Duke University, UCLA and University of Leuven, an analysis of the global oil market between 1970 and 2014, covering more than 13,000 oil fields, found that production restrictions imposed by OPEC increased global oil extraction costs by around $160 billion. Importantly, the way OPEC and OPEC+ assesses the market has evolved significantly. To an outside observer, it may seem that the group's decisions to raise or lower production are based on current oil prices. In the past, that was partly true. The strategy relied on a price band mechanism, aimed at keeping the price of a barrel within a predefined range. Over time, however, that model was abandoned. Today, the group focuses primarily on changes in oil inventories in OECD countries. And so the year 2026 was supposed to be a breakthrough for OPEC+. After years of frustration, many members believed that production quotas had been allocated unfairly by the group's leadership. At the summit on November 30th, 2025, OPEC+ proved a long-awaited mechanism for determining maximum sustainable capacity, or MSC. An external audit was commissioned to assess the real production capacity of each member state. In other words, the amount of oil a given country can reach within 90 days and then sustain for another year. The results of that audit were meant to provide the new basis for new baseline quotas, set to apply from 2027. This would have marked a fundamental change, because the new system for setting production limits would finally reward countries that had genuinely invested in expanding their production infrastructure, countries such as the UAE. In the face of the war with Iran, however, the implementation of this new plan now appears uncertain. Even so, in its official communique after the June summit, OPEC+ continues to declare its intention to move forward with it. Trying to define the medium and long-term consequences for the oil market and for OPEC+ itself is unusually difficult today, because several major question marks are piling up on the horizon. First, we do not know what condition the key producers in the Persian Gulf will be in once the current war is over, or how quickly pre-war production levels can be restored. Second, and this is far more politically charged, the future role of Iran itself remains unclear. Like Venezuela and Libya, Iran formally belongs to OPEC and is part of the wider OPEC+ framework, but is currently exempt from binding production limits. The lifting of sanctions on Tehran could be a major game changer for the future of the market, but not necessarily in the way many might expect. The return of Iranian crude to regular markets would not significantly increase net supply. Before the war, Iranian production was already close to maximum levels, as was Iranian crude exports, almost all of which went to China. Those barrels are therefore already in the system, just locked inside the Chinese circuit and outside the classic market mechanism. Of course, Iran will have a strong incentive to rebuild its market position and broaden its customer base as quickly as possible, both in Europe and in Asia. Under sanctions, Tehran had to remain invisible and evade sanctions, which gave China enormous leverage. Beijing bought Iranian crude at a steep discount, often using floating storage options that functioned as a kind of customs warehouse. So what may change is not the amount of Iranian oil in the world, but the direction of its flows, and the pace of that change will be limited. Over years of sanctions, Iran managed to build an alternative oil trading system. This included not only the creation of a shadow fleet and mechanisms for laundering crude, including STS operations or ship-to-ship transfers, onto tankers with no direct links to Iran, but also an alternative payments system between countries. This made Iran dependent not only on a single buyer, China, but also on a very specific profile of customers. Sanctioned crude could be purchased only by smaller independent refineries, the so-called teapots, operating outside the main global financial system. Reversing this process is possible, but it could take months. The return of Iranian oil to the market will therefore be neither fast nor linear, even if a formal agreement with the United States is reached. The first bottleneck will appear at the fleet level. Tanker availability is limited, and vessels carrying Iranian crude as a part of the shadow fleet often fail to meet the technical and legal requirements expected by insurers and by most ports. It may turn out that after a possible easing or lifting of sanctions on Iran, the transitional scenario will look much like 2022-2023, when the Biden administration in practice turned a blind eye to a large-scale Iranian oil exports to China despite formally existing restrictions. Especially with the US midterms approaching and with calming fuel market sentiment, one of Donald Trump's key challenges. Saudi Arabia, in any case, will watch this situation with mixed feelings. For years, under sanctions, Iran was de facto excluded from the quota management mechanism, and Iranian barrels flowing through an alternative system did not compete with others in the same way. This gave the Saudis and the UAE room to pursue their volume policy without having to negotiate with Tehran. Iran's return to regular exports means its return to the negotiating table inside the group. On top of that, Iran now holds a tool it did not have before the war, a proven ability to paralyze the Strait of Hormuz, which changes its bargaining position within the group. In this extremely fragile arrangement, the next test for the unity of the Saudi-Russian alliance remains Vladimir Putin, and the question of ending the war in Ukraine. At first glance, Moscow may appear to cooperate closely with Riyadh and support it, but the history of OPEC Plus has shown clearly that Russia's strategy within the group can be ruthless, even toward the country that invited it to the table. The Kremlin never intended to put the group's goals above the short-term interests of Russian oil giants, let alone above the strategy of the Russian state. So if the prospect of a deal with the West and the lifting of some restrictions appears on the horizon, Russia may once again redefine its priorities. And although Russia does not currently possess large spare production capacity, it may, in an attempt to regain old markets, once again abandon the agreement in favor of maximizing exports and fighting brutally for its share of the pie. As with Iran, a mere redirection of flows could be just as destabilizing for the global balance as a change in volume, especially since open calls to leave OPEC Plus agreement are heard in the Kremlin from time to time. One of the most prominent voices is Igor Sechin, the head of Rosneft, who in February 2019 sent an official letter to President Putin describing OPEC Plus as a quote strategic threat to Russian interests. He argued that it constrained Rosneft's growth and handed market share to US shale. So far we have been talking about supply, but the demand side remains just as crucial and just as unpredictable, because it simply shapes OPEC Plus policy. The global economy still faces the risk of a slowdown. Green technologies are taking a growing share of the market, and at the same time many countries may follow China's example. In recent years, China's enormous appetite for crude has no longer been driven only by current consumption, but also by an aggressive security strategy and the building of massive reserves. That is why understanding today's oil market is almost impossible without understanding China's unique approach. China is the end customer for oil, and its response to market swings works in both directions. Beijing suppresses purchases when prices are high, but can also absorb crude aggressively when it is relatively cheap. Unlike the Western models we are used to, Chinese demand is not a classic market function of consumption nor a simple derivative of export margins. That is why it is so difficult to fit into rigid analytical frameworks. It is no coincidence that in 2025 it was China importing far more oil than Western estimates had assumed that pulled global prices out of the trough. This same mechanism meant that during the current crisis and the paralysis of the Strait of Hormuz, China played the central role in stabilizing prices by sharply cutting crude imports from around 11.5 million barrels per day in February to just 6.6 million barrels in May, the lowest level since 2016, according to Kepler data. Without exaggeration, China can be described as the mirror image of OPEC Plus on the demand side. As a result, the future balance of the global market will depend on how and how quickly Beijing decides to rebuild its demand. And that in turn means the ultimate fate and effectiveness of OPEC Plus now lie, to a large extent, in the hands of China. To sum up, the OPEC cartel as we knew it at the turn of the century is undergoing a dramatic transformation, and the main catalysts of this erosion are external players. For the group's leader, Saudi Arabia, preserving the unity of the alliance now means operating in extremely unfavorable conditions. Riyadh must navigate the reality of missiles flying over Hormuz, deal with the political earthquake caused by the UAE's unexpected exit, and account for the desire of other members to gain more independence, especially those frustrated by production limits they see as too low. But it would be a mistake to write off Saudi power too soon. The Saudis still possess the most flexible infrastructure and a powerful buffer of spare capacity which could allow them to wage one more price war. The problem is that today's crisis has shown that Saudi strategy must now account for an entirely new paradigm, an inverted OPEC+, China. In the background of this geopolitical chess game, fundamental structural risks are also smoldering, risks the market cannot afford to ignore. On the one hand, there is growing uncertainty over long-term oil demand in the era of the energy transition. On the other, as numerous reports indicate, dangerously low investment in the upstream sector. Capital is essential not only to stimulate production growth, but above all to offset the decline rate, the natural fall in output and gradual depletion of fields already in production. But the long-term outlook is a subject for another episode. Perhaps then, Trump in 2009 was wrong only about the mechanism. OPEC is not being destroyed by a single decision in Washington, a single price war, or a single split inside the cartel. The erosion is slower, more chaotic and less spectacular. Allies start playing for themselves. Former adversaries return to the table. And more of the market's balance shifts from Riyadh and Moscow to Beijing. The main question is no longer how much oil OPEC Plus will pump, but whether in a world of new wars, new technologies and new centers of demand, the cartel is still capable of controlling the game it once created.